Hello, welcome to another episode of our SANS OSINT live stream. We are joined today by Sarah Womer, Unleashed OSINT on Twitter, and we're going to be talking about OPSEC, Operations Security, and how that relates to open source intelligence. So we also have David Mashburn and Nico Dekens, my co-authors of the Advanced OSINT course with SANS. But Sarah, welcome. Thank you for joining our show.
Thank you.
Why don't we start out? Maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and background, what got you into OSINT, and we'll take it from there.
Okay. I've always been into research. I actually started doing a lot of research in high school when I was on the debate team. And then I was a research assistant at college and on the debate team and Model UN, all of which I did research for. Then ended up working as a journalist, which I did a lot of research for when I was in Kuwait. And then I started working with the defense company as a research analyst on WMD issues and Middle East regional issues. And then 9/11 hit, and I started doing research on terrorist websites. And that's how I got into OSINT. So
cool.
Wow, that's impressive. Phase 3.
Yeah, and that's a background where operations security is important, right? Some folks are doing research and maybe it's not that much of an issue, but there are certain targets that you're researching where you definitely want to be a little bit more careful. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what is OPSEC?
Well, OPSEC is operational security, and whenever anybody goes online, they should have some level of operational security for what they're doing, whether it's a kid doing homework. The level of what is needed changes. So if it's somebody who is, let's say, a youth, they might need to know a part of OPSEC is not downloading just any screensaver because they think it's beautiful. That's a common sense one for somebody like in middle school. Once you get older and you're doing things like online banking, obviously at that point you want to have a better level of operational security for when you're doing things online. But once you're doing open source intelligence where you have a client and you have a collection requirement, and that requirement might be proprietary or something you don't want disclosed, at that point that level of operational security goes much higher. So I would say that, when you're looking at operational security, it's something that everybody should have. The level of what is used, though, would be different dependent on needs.
So I have a question for you. So depending on needs, what is something that should be, in your book, a standard when it comes to OPSEC for, let's say, the most common research cases within open source intelligence? Let me just give you one example. You're trying to find me. You're trying to figure out where I live. That's your goal. That's your task. What is some fundamentals in OPSEC for you?
Well, if I was trying to find out where you live, I would first want to possibly use a research account. I'd want to make sure to divide or partition my research from my everyday activities. Those two things should be kept completely different or completely separate, so there's no cross pollution. And then also, that at that point, because queries are saved, Google gets all your queries if you're using Google. Other search engines can keep your queries. Is you have to look at, okay, do I want to use a research account for my query on pulling data on this individual? And then you also, of course, want to use a tool that is protecting your privacy when you are doing the research, whether it's a person lookup tool or whether it's a browser, is to look at what is that item collecting on you while you're collecting. Mm-hmm. So if I'm just looking up a basic address and phone number of something to send a Christmas card, I probably will not use a research account, and I will just, look up an easy to use lookup tool, and if it's in the United States, because in the United States privacy is horrid, and you can look up pretty much anyone to get that address for that Christmas card. But if I'm pulling up let's say a suspect of like a drug case, that changes again the formula of what I would do for looking up that person and where they might live.
So for me, it sounds like that for every case, you basically need to think of tools, techniques, and procedures from a operation security perspective. So,
Absolutely.
Which means that looking at one of the comments coming in where someone says, "Hey, Tails Linux is perfect for what she's talking about," would you agree on that, or would you say like, "Hey, I have some different opinions on that"?
I mean, it depends what you're doing, and it depends on what you have access to. Some countries, specifically Tails, might be great because Tails can help you bypass censorship in addition to adding a layer of protection. Is it foolproof? Is Tor and Tails foolproof? That's debatable, but not really. Is there other things that you could do? Like use a VM and a VPN and all that kind of stuff. Yes. So I mean, it depends on how much you want to put into it. But I mean, Tor and Tails with Linux is not, it's not a bad way to go. It's not 100% OPSEC though. So I would say it's a higher level of OPSEC, right, but it's not like the highest.
Yeah, I mean, keep in mind that Tor can, if someone's monitoring the exit nodes and stuff, and you're just hopping through Tor, that they can see where you're going. There's definitely holes in various tools that people need to be aware of. And again, where you are on the scale of how important it is to be absolutely hidden or not is a part of that.
Well, and I think there's another point here as well, is that when you're using these tools that are highly anonymizing, that in itself becomes an indicator if someone's tracking you, right? Is it better for me to try to blend in as I'm in the fat part of the bell curve, or if I'm one extreme or the other? That is telling in and of itself. And so while I think tools like Tails are great, my thought is, if I am if I'm an adversary and you're interacting with my resources, that's going to be a big flashing red light that someone doesn't want me to know something about them, versus, hey, this is just a standard Windows or Mac running Chrome, fairly recent versions. Doesn't really stand out for any particular reason. You can still, so go ahead, Sarah. I think you had a response to that.
Yeah. I completely agree with you on that. I actually just got blocked last week utilizing one of the stopgap tools, because the domain that I was going to go look at knew that I was using a stopgap tool. And so that domain was like, no, you can't open the domain. That same domain also blocked no-touch research with Internet Archive and would not allow you to use Internet Archive on that domain. And it also would not allow a user to use PDF my URL. So on the simple level, like the simple stuff, it was blocking all of that. And it was also blocking big VPNs, like it wouldn't allow Norton. It did allow Proton. So the first, I'd say one of the first levels of OPSEC that somebody can do, let's say they don't have like a budget, is the first thing they can do is try and use a no-touch research with free resources. So that means using things like archive tools to save the page instead of clicking on that URL in the first place. So they can take the URL that they want to look at, put it into Internet Archive Wayback Machine, save it into Internet Archive Wayback Machine, and then see what's on that page without ever actually physically touching that page. Now that's if you don't mind that the domain sees that Internet Archive is going to it.
Yeah, I think there's a real balance there between sometimes your operation security, the tools you're using, and your ability to collect. Also, do I want to appear to be this weird, hyper secure system contacting this infrastructure, or do I want to look like everybody else?
Yeah, and I think that's the key, right? Because OPSEC, or at least how I look at it, and I would love to hear all of your opinions, is OPSEC is not a tool. OPSEC is a methodology. That's a way of denying an adversary valuable information that could expose you or your mission. Or at least that's what OPSEC for me is about when I was doing a lot of counterterrorism work. So there are many places on the internet that I could safely visit, still do my research without, let's say, any OPSEC at all or nearly none. But there are also some cases where you want to have, let's say, at least something in between you and your target. What's your opinion on, because when I talk about people, when I talk with people about OPSEC, the first thing that they ask is, what tools do you use? And my answer is always, hey, the first step would be to critically think, what is my problem and what could be the risks?
You really got to tailor it. Yeah.
Well, and I think you're absolutely right. And when you have a collection requirement, the first thing that you should be looking at before you even open up a URL is what level of OPSEC is needed, and whether or not you need it paired with like an indigenous looking system. So if you're going someplace, do you need OPSEC and blend into where you're going, or do you just need OPSEC? Because if you need OPSEC and an indigenous system, at that point, that goes back to what David had mentioned right before we came in, is making an environment that looks indigenous to make sure that it's that it blends in. And you'd want to include it at the same time zone. You may even want to look at the language interface of the OS, and having those things in there. So, but yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yeah, and Nico, it's kind of maybe a slightly different take on this too, as we've seen when you're running tools, sometimes honestly, you need to have a little OPSEC against the service you may be trying to scrape. So if you're scraping social media or other things, which is more challenging these days, if my tools have marks on them, user agent strings and other things, sometimes I get very different results than if I take those user agent strings and actually change them to look more like a standard browser.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's also OPSEC, right? Because when we talk about looking at social media, for example, you need a sock puppet for most social media platforms to at least visit those, to authenticate to those platforms. But then they could alarm maybe an adversary once you visit their page. So you need to make sure that your sock puppet is plausible, so they won't be alarmed. For example, on LinkedIn, one could set up a recruiter type account that looks normal because people get page visits all the time by recruiter that is in that same industry. So most likely it will not ring an alarm. But if you're going to say, hey, I am Detective XYZ on LinkedIn, and you're going to look at your target, well, it may be a little bit of a tell. I just noticed, Sarah, there's a sock puppet behind you in the room.
That actually is my very first sock puppet.
Wow.
So this is my very first sock puppet. This was made for me when I was 6 from a turquoise colored sock, and I still have it.
That's awesome.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, a real sock puppet.
So.
That's awesome.
So maybe you can walk us through a use case again, because I would love to hear based upon your experiences, Sarah, because you talked about a lot of the statical web pages that you can visit with making sure that you're not being tracked or non-attribution lookups by doing it through an archive.org kind of resource. But how would you tackle, let's say, a social media platform? So you want to look at someone and you need to visit that social media platform. What would you do from, let's say, some basic standard steps? What would be your standard OPSEC here?
Well, okay, so this also differs because it depends. Do you need collection from that social media platform for a short amount of time or for a long amount of time? So, and you need to think about how much scrutiny is that platform or the actors on that platform going to be paying attention to your research account. Mm-hmm. So, obviously you'd want to try and build rapport as far as persona through your research account. So you want to make, as you said, your research account look believable. And that can be regional also. So you need to actually research your research account. What kind of name do you want to use? How do you want it to look? One of the worst things that you can do is just grab a photo online for your research account, because a lot of times I just, when I'm bored, I will bust poorly made sock puppets, and I will actually rate them on my Twitter account by reverse image search and saying I grade this research account as a D or as a F, because it's too easy to do reverse image search to figure out who has it. So for a profile pic at that point, you're looking at either a profile pic that's not human, or if you want to do a human, using artificial intelligence, or finding a photo that is not online of a human being that's not going to be able to be easily reverse searched. So, there's you can do a whole entire class just on how to set up an effective research account. And then the other thing is if you're looking at foreign social media platforms that are foreign to you, as in a different language, you might want to use a translator. You might need to get a translator to work with you to make a believable research account, because some things, if you translate them, but they will come across as being artificial. I'm not fluent, but I speak some Arabic, and there's some things that I know from living in the Middle East, but there's other phrases, if I say it, it's like, okay, is that formal from a textbook, or is that how somebody on the street would say it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Slang, sarcasm, idioms, that kind of figure of speech.
Absolutely.
If you're doing foreign other language targets, you absolutely need some expertise there, because you can blow your cover real fast if you don't.
Yeah. And then if you want an account for a long time, as a research account on a specific target, then that account needs to be made, in advance. You should probably season it for a while before it's even employed. And then you also need to make sure that you don't just engage it on the days that you want to collect, because then it's like, well, why isn't this, why is that inconsistency there as a research account? So, there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. And then somebody earlier was talking about, tools and being careful about, what is the resource that you're using getting from you. So what is being collected on the collector?
Mm-hmm.
And that goes everything from, a platform, if you're employing a corporate level enterprise tool, who owns it, who are you buying it from, where is it housed out of, to when you're borrowing somebody's code or API on GitHub. And there's awesome OSINT tools on GitHub that are open source that are just, they're beautiful. But you can't just grab them and use them. You have to look and see, who made it? Is it being maintained?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's, if you just grab anything, you don't know whether or not that tool is collecting or infecting.
Right.
Yeah, we discussed this in our course. You definitely need to understand your tools. You need to know what they're doing. Are they communicating somewhere and sharing the information that you're collecting, or you need to know that stuff.
Go ahead. Sorry, John, I didn't mean to talk over you there. So it comes back to the basic point is your OPSEC is really built upon a good foundation of basic InfoSec, right? To understand what I'm deployed, managing my assets, the kind of stuff we deal with operationally in almost any security environment. But having said that, and we go to build our platforms, do you have a particular one that you consider your go-to? Say we're doing research that has a moderate level of OPSEC, not anything where I feel like there's a physical threat, but generally I would rather be, have non-attribution, but if I did, it's not the end of the world. What's kind of your basic go-to, Sarah, to kind of build out that OSINT platform? We've talked a lot about procedures. Now maybe we want to get into tools a little bit.
Okay. Well, I like two things. The first is I like just for basic everyday stuff, no touch research, even for news sites. I did self guinea pig for a while on one of my systems to see what would be collected on me. But it's better just because of all the super cookies and browser fingerprinting, even looking at news articles, to utilize no touch, just because so many things are tracking you. But I've actually switched now for everyday stuff is I've started to go over to just using VMware Fusion desktop. I really like it. I went to the EU Open Source Summit in Dublin this last month, and I was very fortuitous that I got to speak with one of their VN representatives at the conference, and he gave me actually about 3 hours of his time, which was awesome. And so we went through some of the things that I can do with it on Ubuntu just for basic everyday use. So you get, a VMware Fusion or something like that with Ubuntu. You employ it with the browsers that you want in there. Then as far as VPNs you have to be really careful with, because some VPNs heavily collect on you and then some don't.
Right.
So with VPNs, I really like Proton, and Proton, like for research on Russia, I was kind of paranoid because Proton has a Russian IP, which is awesome because that allows things not to be blocked. But at the same time, that means that it has a Russian IP. So, so that office in Russia, if you're really worried about it, even though it's supposedly totally fine, there is an option on Proton where you can select for your IP to be routed through Switzerland first before it goes to Russia, the Russian IP.
Very cool.
And I love that option. That's great because so many people are going to that Swiss IP that the Russian IP would have a really hard time differentiating specifically who's coming from the Swiss IP.
Right.
Yeah.
That brings me to what I was going to ask about as far as targeting some of these foreign countries that maybe have significant control over internet traffic. China, for example, Russia has been trying to do that to some degree of success. What are some sort of tips for collecting in those zones? Again, keeping in mind that some of the resources you're trying to hit in, say, China aren't going to give you much or anything if you are coming from, a UK space or something like that.
You have to use a tool that would access .cn. So you would have to evaluate which tool you want to utilize to evaluate .cn, and then maybe also do some research on the most updated venues that are being used in .cn to bypass that country's censorship, which can also be of use. So that's the one thing. And then dealing with that same topic and related, which is a little bit strange, is that because the United States specifically, and I'm from the United States, we don't have the same level of privacy as the European Union does with GDPR. And so what has ended up happening is there's hundreds, if not thousands, of US websites that block all EU countries, their IPs.
Yep.
So in order to collect that data from those US domains, I actually have to use some of the same tactics that I would use to go to China or Russia or someplace else.
Which is kind of hilarious, right?
It is. I actually ran into it today with a news station. I was like, oh, there's an article on Florida and, being careful with scams for donating money to people in Florida because of the hurricane. I was like, oh, cool. But I hadn't switched my IP over from one IP to another IP. I think I was in Austria. But the U.S. news station blocked me and wouldn't let me read the article, and so I had to stop and change and go and then had access. So
kind of following up that thought about dealing with blocks, because certainly, speaking as someone who defends enterprise networks, it's pretty easy for us to know, hey, this is coming from a VPN provider, or it's coming from a Tor exit node, or things like that, or do I have traffic to say originating from a cloud service like a VPS, if something's hosted out there versus that? So what are your challenges or your workarounds when you're trying to do a VPN and you find you're being blocked? Do you try to leverage, you talk about using no touch, and that may have been your first stop. So I've tried my no touch. Now I'm on the VPN trying to get more, and I'm maybe getting blocked. What do you usually try to do from there?
Well,
Wow.
I have done everything from, I did an experiment in the United States. I openly admit it was an experiment. There was a cyber person in Japan who was trying to elicit me through LinkedIn. And I had assessed after reverse researching the person's background, that this was somebody that probably had significant cyber capabilities. So what I did is I went and got a burner with a prepaid phone card data, and made sure that I was in a geographically different area. And then I wore sunglasses and a baseball cap. And then I actually spoke with him. But that's like to the extreme, and it was just an experience, it was an experiment to see if it worked. It did work, and that person actually called me from a white room, and I was thinking, oh my god, how cliche is that?
Yeah.
But I think they were very disappointed. Now, saying that, I'm not InfoSec, so it truly was an experiment on my part. I'm OSINT OPSEC. I've started to get into, or I shouldn't say I'm not InfoSec. I've started to go into InfoSec from trial and error from many years of doing research, starting in 2001, when I was put on a computer by a client, which I won't specify, in which they wouldn't let me have appropriate OPSEC. And I had very serious problems with that because it put me at risk. So, but going back to your original statement, then you have to start looking at building out your own system or your own configuration. So you mentioned Azure, maybe you want to use that. Or maybe you want to use something else. Maybe you want to use a throwaway computer that's on a dedicated IP that is not cross-polluted with your IP. So there are things that you can do.
Mm-hmm.
And even make some pops like through Alibaba, or just have other infrastructure maybe that looks like it's in those regions that you're looking at, for example.
Right. I mean, from my perspective, and I think we talked about this on the pregame or the pre-show, is that I think there's some intriguing possibilities coming up, because we've often used cloud servers, but there are still services that say, hey, this is coming from a server range that is allocated to Amazon. This is a little weird. But with the rise of kind of virtual desktops, hosted desktops, I think it opens a world of possibilities, because now I can set up a desktop in a different region, load my tools, do my research, and when I'm done, pull my data, make it poof, and now it's coming from as far as the target's concerned, it's coming from a block of IPs owned by Microsoft. It's not a VPN. So again, I think there's some advantages there. That obviously is a little more overhead, a little more technical capabilities required to maintain that. But just kind of throwing that to the group. Have Nico or John, are you doing any of that yet?
I have done. It is becoming more mainstream now for everyone doing remote work and things like that. That people might be coming from weird spaces. At a previous employer, they had set up some basically VMs hosted on Amazon AWS, and we would use those. Again, sometimes you'd run into those issues where there'd be blocks for where you're trying to collect from, simply because you're on AWS IP space. So sometimes you had to route through VPNs and things, but that's stuff.
I use it. I used to use this particularly when I needed to travel, let's say, to a country where I don't want to bring my own laptop to the border. And I brought a burner laptop, but at home I set up a cloud virtual machine. So when I was in the country, I could use the internet to then start searching through that cloud VM to make sure that I collected data. That could be a scenario. And I also just use it because cloud VMs, they are online 24/7, or at least you can choose to. And I like to turn off my laptop by the end of the day, or at least, then I can still start collecting or looking at data with making use of certain scripts or something like that. Now, there was something that triggered me in one of your comments. So you clearly know how to have that non-attribution, but do you also know how to detect if you are being compromised? So if someone knows that you have let's say, certain OPSEC in place, do you have certain tips for that, or certain things that we should be alert of?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is traditionally some people have thought about OPSEC as it relates to just the domain and what the domain might be collecting. But what has happened is now, anybody can go out and buy ad trackers. An advertising company can go buy ad trackers. A organization can go buy ad trackers. A country can go buy ad trackers. A country can have access to ad tracking services in some instances in their country. And the first time I was actually hacked by an ad tracker was very early on. It was in, it was in 2002, I want to say, or in 2004. I forget which one, but it was Gatorware, which was an ad tracking thing. And there was an organization that was extremist in nature that had taken Gatorware and had tweaked it and was using it when you went to their website for tracking. So one way to circumvent that issue, and it's evolved massively since then, is to use things to check for ad tracking. So two of my favorite are, actually three of my favorite, are the first one is your URL scan IO, which URL scan IO is great.
Great
The
resource.
other one is the markup blacklight. The markup blacklight does not go down to the level of detail as the next tool I'm going to recommend. But the one thing I really love about the markup blacklight is that it provides a whole section that you can extend or expand, explaining the canvas fingerprinting. So if there's canvas fingerprinting that can be doing keystroke monitoring, it will actually describe it, and it'll explain which company is doing the keystroke monitoring, or the keystroke monitoring. Then the third one that I like to use is I really like Dr. Augustine Fo's page X-ray. That is like one of the most in-depth resources for looking at specifically what trackers are coming from a site. So Gizmodo, like a few weeks ago, I went to a Gizmodo page. They had 1,000 and something, trackers, and then it'll show if there's browser fingerprinting, and it'll show with the red line if there's super cookie, and then you can look at the actual ad trackers because it has the company name on each one. And if the one looks like you're like, ooh, what company is this? You can take it and you can do research on that tracker. And then you can find out sometimes that the tracker isn't actually a company, and it's actually a piece of malware that is advertising itself as an ad tracker. Mm-hmm. And then you can take that over and migrate it to something like, Alien Vault OTX and Virus Total and some of those other tools, and then start investigating what kind of malvertising or malware you are getting from that tracker. One of the biggest problems I found is super cookies, because super cookies, somebody asked me the other day when I was doing a webinar, how can you get a super cookie off your system? And I was like, well, you can kind of delete the components of it. And I'm like, I don't know. And then I was like really thinking about it, and I was doing some more research on it. You really can't, because a super cookie is housed on an outside server. So as soon as your fingerprint is recognized again, that cookie's coming back.
So from a different angle, so this is so let's say companies are tracking you. So what is the risk? What is the risk? I'm now researching scripter hacker boy XYZ. What is my risk now from being tracked by, let's say, CNN or by bbc.co.uk? So I'm trying to find news articles because he's hacker boy XYZ. I'm interested in him. So what's the risk for me from an operations security perspective from being tracked by super cookies or ad IDs?
Well, see, and we have a huge problem right now with ad fraud. And I mean, I'm not going to say I'm an expert on it. Dr. Augustine Fo is definitely an expert on it. But what I've learned on this topic is that one of the biggest issues is it might not be CNN or BBC's fault, because they're not paying attention to what ad tracking is on their domain in the first place, because they use a middleman to buy those ad trackers.
Yeah.
The system is so distributed with these intermediaries. I mean, that's how advertising and trackers, and no one's really paying much attention. So,
right. And Nico, to kind of to your point, I don't think it's so much the risk is that CNN is tracking you. It's the people placing the ads. There was an article recently, and I forget exactly which platform, so I don't want to, misstate the platform, but it was one of the major socials. And what was happening is a nation state was making this very targeted advertisement to specifically ferret out a group of, essentially dissenters, right? Because based on the demographic characteristics available in the ad tool, they were able to very uniquely identify these people. And so I think that's really kind of the risk that, Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's kind of what you're aiming at. It's not so much CNN, it's what a third party could learn about you from that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to get our audience also to understand that and that angle. So one other question. Do you also monitor your own sock puppet accounts? Because for example, I just monitor my own sock puppet account credentials from being leaked and hacked. So are the passwords that I use hacked, even though I use two-factor authentication all the time. Is that something that you think should be in your standard operating procedures or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference for me between sock puppets and research accounts. Research accounts are passive for collection, and a sock puppet account maybe does plus plus.
Okay.
But going to that, I think that it's important if you have a long-term sock puppet account, obviously you want to maintain it, because it's not, in order to make an effective sock puppet, that's not a 5-minute endeavor. Some people just don't get that. They think, oh, you can just make a research account and, go out there and you can do it in one day and get everything you want. And you're like, okay, because they don't understand.
They don't understand.
They don't understand the amount of time and effort and thought that has to be used in crafting that research account.
Yeah, but that's also part of OPSEC, right? Because when I was doing counterterrorism work and I wanted to position myself, let's say, in certain somewhat more close channels or groups, I needed to build up that persona so other people would think, hey, this is a guy that we trust, that we can rely upon. So sometimes it took me even longer than a year, or sometimes even longer than 2 years to position. And it could be totally passive just by asking those really generic questions. Hey, what are you guys doing this weekend? Or just to start building that persona, maybe liking someone else's post. But it's also sometimes walking a thin line, because you could be, let's say, breaking the law with sharing someone else's content and still trying to build a persona, keeping OPSEC in mind.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. And then I think there's also a difference, just like there's different levels in OPSEC, like what's needed for OPSEC. I think that same concept also applies to research accounts. So, case in point is, Sector 035 is a sock puppet account. And I say sock puppet because it's not just a passive research account; it engages. That is an overt sock puppet. It's a popular overt sock puppet that actually has creds, because people in the OSINT community have lifted it up as having creds. So that would be a overt versus covert a research account. And so how hidden does it need to be? Is it something that you want overt, semi-overt, semi-covert, totally covert? I mean,
that's somewhere that everyone needs to figure out for themselves for the research that they're doing.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
so this is why I think it could be good to build, let's say, some flow charts for yourself. So let's say the audience that now is listening, hey audience, by the way, so you could think of that you have cases that it's okay if someone finds out that someone is researching them. They wouldn't necessarily know that it's you because you're using that VPN, you may be using that virtual machine, and then you may have covert/clandestine, where you feel highly uncomfortable if someone even finds out that someone is looking at them, just because they get pinged or they get an alert. And you could basically start building your standard operating procedures and you refine them case by case, and there will always be lessons learned. Sometimes you just don't want to turn on certain add-ons or extensions because that by itself could be a tell that you are trying to hide something. Is that something that you would also practice and preach to others, that there is no one recipe, but you could come up with, let's say, for common cases, a scenario?
Well, yes, because I think it goes back to what you said earlier. OPSEC is not a tool. OPSEC is a methodology, and OPSEC in and of itself entails analysis. So you have to look at your collection requirement and say, okay, here's what my collection requirement is. This is my acceptable level of risk. And you have to look at what that risk level is. Is the risk level that somebody might if it's goes to the risk level of somebody could theoretically physically hurt you, obviously at that point your OPSEC levels can be really, really high. or is the risk, that maybe there's not really any risk except you don't want to be tracked by cookies, so I think it goes back to what you said with, you have to have that analysis there at the front end on the acceptable level of risk that you are willing to take. And then based on that, you build out on methodologies and tactics and then tools.
Yeah. It really comes down to those requirements. Like as a private investigator, I had cases sometimes where, there's litigation involved and they actually wanted you to do a noisy investigation. They actually wanted the target to be aware that they were being investigated. That doesn't happen as much, I think, in online OSINT stuff. But the client may not care that much if the target knows that they're being investigated, for example.
Yeah, to disrupt, it could be a good technique. If someone, let's just assume that there's a fairly large group trying to rally or demonstrate somewhere, and City Hall or that local authority don't want that to happen. Local police could just jump in that Telegram group and say, hey, we know that you are planning something. So you don't even have to have OPSEC. Or you want to sit in that group covertly, knowing where they are going to meet, where they're going to set up that rally, where they're going to, let's say, do certain things. So it really depends. Yeah, it really depends on what you want to
you
find
bring
out.
That up, since it's Dutch law enforcement that does these kind of things sometimes, right?
We would never do these things in the Netherlands.
I actually have an example that I can throw out that I observed on SnapMap. When I was stateside, I had noticed one area on SnapMap had a lot of drug sales being posted on SnapMap, and I actually was able to geolocate one person who was being sadly probably sold. And so I was able to get it down to the front of the hotel by looking at the drapes and all that kind of stuff. And I, sent it off to whoever it needed to go to. But what happened was during that period of time, there was an uptick of this activity on SnapMap. Then a couple days later, there was a virtual police car on SnapMap.
Huh.
So
that's cool.
So the law enforcement made, or somebody pretending to be law enforcement. I didn't talk to law enforcement about it. So either law enforcement made a research account that was overt, or you could say that's not a research account at that point. That's a straight sock puppet, because they're engaging the public. Or somebody was pretending to be law enforcement.
Don't try that at home, by the way. Never.
Okay. So I don't know which one, if it was somebody pretending to be law enforcement or law enforcement, but it seemed to me that it was effective because just from observation, it looked like there was a decline in illegal things being put on SnapMap in that area.
Yeah, and it also comes to mind now that also part of OPSEC is that most people who are practicing open source intelligence from a research or, let's say, an analyst perspective have 9-to-5 jobs, so they are behind their computer from 9 to 5. And if you're going to do research, that could be an OPSEC risk if you only do that between those times. Sometimes you want to do some research outside of office hours, maybe in the weekend, maybe late at night, just to blend in and not stand out, because normal people are online outside of office hours.
Right.
Yeah, if you're doing, cyber threat intel, you think about TTPs as something you're researching to discover things about other people. This is really flipping that script and trying to blend in, to not have visible TTPs that your adversary can be tipped off on.
Yeah,
I think that's an excellent point, because if you have IPs coming from the same place or they have a similar pattern and they keep coming through during the same time block, and if the domain is paying attention, that's definitely going to stand out. So.
Yeah, a lot of logs. When I look at my own domain, I can literally see, let's say, reoccurring accounts based upon their fingerprint and IP address, and I can literally see where they are interested in, because there is some tracking software that can even show you how long their mouse is positioned over a piece of text on a page. So I know where they're interested in, but also by maybe looking at the mouse movement coming from right to left, where most Arabic countries read from right to left, could be a tell that's an Arabic speaking or reading person trying to look at, let's say, Western content. Those are those little things that when you do this research, when I was researching, let's say, a lot of Arabic content, I deliberately made choices to move my mouse from right to left on a web page and screen, just to not tell the adversary that I normally read from left to right, for example. Just those little things could be a tell for certain cases.
And you raised an interesting point with that, which we didn't really discuss, which is we discussed trackers on domains, but we didn't really discuss site meters. So, a lot of site meters, you don't even know they're there. So you just assume that there is a site meter there, unless you check each domain with like built with and URL scan info and all that kind of stuff. But if you're not going to go check the URL for every single visit with those kinds of things, then you should just assume that there is a site meter there that can be collecting that.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
So I think if we're going to wrap this up slowly, I would like to ask each and one of you just one question. What is one of the favorite tools or techniques that you use on, let's say, a daily basis that you want the audience to know about? Sarah, you maybe first?
Okay. Well, just for everyday stuff, as I said, I really like no-touch research. If you don't touch it, can't hurt you.
Yeah.
And then I also, as I said, I really have gotten into VMware Fusion for desktop. I'm enjoying it. I'm hip with it, and I'm currently enjoying Proton's VPN. Although I also have NordVPN and I have Norton VPN. But with any VPN, I go and check, who owns it, and what do they collect. What does the VPN collect? So
really important.
Yeah.
David, for you?
For me, really, it's kind of going down the cloud route, and that kind of works with kind of what I do, and having those resources out somewhere else where it kind of puts another layer of attribution between me and whatever I'm looking at. So not just we kind of talked about both old school like hosted servers, but also looking at the desktop offerings. I think that's going to be something that's more mainstream in the future. Sarah talked about using virtual machines, which is great, but you still have that whole point of I have to figure out where this traffic is coming from. That does address some of that, not all of it, certainly some of it.
For me, it's using, completely distinct hardware and software from what you do other stuff with. I mean, I have a sandbox that I do malware analysis and things on, but I also use it for research. I have different VMs that I can use, different VPNs, and it's just having separation there with what you're doing from other things that are not research, that are not doing that kind of work.
Yeah, great.
All right, Nico,
for me personally, I like to use a lot of GitHub scripts, just like Sarah just told me, and especially someone else's code. So for me, I really spend a lot of time at looking someone else's code. Is it communicating with something? Is it doing something that I feel uncomfortable with? And on top of that, one of my, let's say, weird side hobbies is trying to build as much as possible personas and try to age them and make them look realistic. And that would be my main tip, because with all the social media out there, start building sock puppets, people, or personas.
You're going to need them.
You're going to need them. Yeah.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. I thought this was great. We covered a lot of ground. Very interesting insight that you have into this space, into OPSEC. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and don't forget, Sarah gave a great talk at the OSINT Summit, and I think the recording is up on the SANS YouTube channel, so you may want to check it out. Some awesome stuff in there.
Check it out.
Thanks
again.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Cheers.